You may be leaving $1 to $1.5 million on the table in lost earnings over your lifetime if you are not negotiating your salary at the beginning of your career. And that figure doesn't include company retirement contributions based on a percentage of your salary either. Good news, it's never too late to start. So if you want to increase your earnings, this is a way to negotiate your salary. Today's guest, Aaron Thweatt, has helped hundreds of professionals worldwide as a successful executive coach, transforming their careers through coaching and salary negotiation. He's also held a unique position of being a principal compensation consultant, meaning he's the guy who helps determine what you get paid. Welcome, Aaron.
Thank you.
So, Aaron, you worked at some impressive companies like SpaceX, which, trust me, we'd almost all want to go into just understanding what that's like, because everybody reads and hears things. But we won't this time around. Maybe we'll dive into it a little bit, but also Activision Blizzard, as well as some others. Can you share a bit about your journey to becoming an executive coach?
Yeah, thank you. I really got into executive coaching by way of realizing my own challenges. A lot of the biggest decisions I made in my career, in my personal life, I made alone. And, to a lot of the clients I work with now, they had some similar experiences prior to getting a coach. And when I was in HR, which was career number 4 out of 5 total before I got my executive coaching practice started, I navigated a lot of transition, both in types of roles between companies and in economic environments. And I realized that if we have the ability to have all of our faculties being used to manage the conversations in our lives the best as possible, and if that requires help, then we're going to have the best outcomes. And that's ultimately what drove me to wanting to be of service to others. So that's kind of the macro backdrop of why I chose coaching. It's a genuine passion. Now, the real start, though, was when I was in HR/compensation, at SpaceX, DoorDash, Activision Blizzard, AECom Technologies, all these companies making those decisions. Once I saw how the game works, I thought everyone needs to know this. And so big mission of mine in conjunction with being a full life coach on the executive front is also helping women negotiate their salaries in corporate America and tech so that they can maximize their worth.
Awesome. And is that a key focus of yours, is for females?
On the salary negotiation side, yes. Executive coaching, I help everyone.
Got it. Okay.
What exactly did you see that made you think that? What were those internal games or whatever? What were you seeing that made you think people should know this?
Once I saw what was possible, how much room there was, there's a lot of social stigma, conditioning, both as we grow up in, our parents' homes and then school, and then our social groups and society at large, that doesn't really encourage a lot of people to advocate for themselves. But when you see what's actually possible, when you're doing the numbers, when you're having daily conversations, you know that there's room to move the needle for yourself if you just say the right words.
I think that is so critical, because one of these stats I'd come across is that, at least suggests that about 89% of men and women who tried to negotiate a higher salary when starting a new job were successful. Now, granted, starting a new job, but still 89%. And yet the number who actually asked for it is 53% of women had never asked for a raise, and 40% of men. So needless to say, less women are asking for it. So I could get how the two of those came together, partially as you look at your focus, I think, around women in negotiation. But either way, there's a discrepancy there of almost 50% of people who don't ever even ask for it. So that advocating for oneself is so critical. And it's crazy when I read this, just because I'm like, wow, having managed teams before, I often felt like team members were always asking, for a raise. But I think that's also based on the relationship with their leader, and how much that's invited. In most orgs, it's not. It's kind of taboo to even talk about sometimes.
Sure. And also, as you can imagine, you as the leader, you were that centralized point that could help them. And so you saw everyone who was interested in asking, but think about the negative space. Think about all the people who never asked.
That's a great point, because when you start breaking it down like that, it's like, yeah, actually there were a lot less. It just sometimes, because of those voices who did, it felt like it was happening regularly because of the process in a corporation to then sometimes rally and advocate on behalf of those individuals is not always super easy.
And why do you think half of people don't ask? Is it that they don't know that they can ask? or is it that they're fearful to ask?
It's a dynamite question. I'll say yes. I think it's a combination of some people genuinely think they can't or shouldn't. A lot of people grew up in homes where the parents told them, hey, you got a job, you should just be happy. I hear this from people who are first generation immigrants, wherever it comes from somewhere. People think that, or are taught that, hey, we should just be happy we have a job, which sure, you should have gratitude, and making sure that you're appropriately priced for your skill set is also an additional thing. You can do both. The second part, Arden, in your question is just being fearful. There's almost an urban legend that if you ask for more money on, say, the job offer, the candidate side, while you're looking for a role, that they're going to pull the offer. Now, I've heard anecdotes of this happening. I'm not going to say it's never happened, but when I was at SpaceX, I did 3,000 job offers personally, and we never felt like that internally. On the first time, if someone negotiates, that's where I learned the phrase in all my seminars and workshops and one-on-one clients to combat that exact threat of an urban myth. Is I tell people every job offer negotiation is like a kitchen remodel. It deserves at least one good counter.
Exactly. It's so true. I have to say as well, like for Arden and I, when we were hiring, whether it's at Disney, whether it's at Netflix, never when somebody asked that, was it like, oh no, sorry. Because at that point, they're the best candidate. You want them. You've committed to wanting them. It's not like you're going to be like, well, none of the others are great, but they want less pay. Let's go for them. No, you're going to do what you can to push for that person. And the nature of roles like that, it does mean that the hiring manager, or depending on who they talk to, it could be HR, whoever it is, there will be a conversation about that, usually both ways. But better to have asked and know there's a conversation than not, because at least I could say for us, back to your, debunking the myth to this degree, never did it happen where somebody was automatically, oh no, you're not the right candidate for this role. What there might be is the answer back to that's the best we could do, at which point the candidate still has the option to say, this isn't going to work for me, thank you. Or to counter again, well, what about putting something in there that allows me to revisit this in 6 months, what you guys say I'm killing it, or 3 months, or can I work some days remote? It's like whatever else you want to put in there. So I'm curious how you approach that, because I'm sure it's come up quite a few times.
For sure. Zooming ahead in the process, but right where you're talking about, the one great thing about what I like about what I do is I help people advocate for themselves in all realms of life. And in the salary negotiation sense, that's just one microcosm of that self-advocacy. And what it does is it helps you find out the truth about what the company really thinks of you, what your manager really thinks of you, what the hiring manager that you might potentially be working for really thinks of you. And with that truth, you can then make an informed decision. You can still take the job. Is this a development opportunity? I always say there's two decisions with a job. It's a learn versus earn. If you can do both, great. But sometimes learning is more beneficial to set you up to earn on the next one. So that's one juncture, or one framework you could use to make that decision. Second, like you said, hey, what about 6 months, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months later? Let's have a commitment to have a meeting to discuss my performance so that I can have an off-cycle raise opportunity. Now, I'd say in a situation like that, your first week, you need to sit with your manager and define those objectives so that you're actually tracking against them. That way you don't get to that 6-month mark and they're like, well, let's set some goals, and then you're punted to next year. And then third is going back to the negotiation. Like I said, jumping towards the end of the process, I like to have staged retreats rather than like, I want more. No, but you can still have the job. Do you still want it? Okay, fine, I'll take it. Rather than just having that thing, you think about, well, what about this? What about that? Is there other elements of compensation? Maybe some non-monetary things. And that's a lot of the prep work that I do with my clients. And in the course I'll be putting out here pretty soon, just to walk people through all those elements. Because once you think expansively, there's a lot that's really possible.
Well put. I'm curious, as you mentioned a couple of the things there, and maybe backing it up a little bit to the process. When you are working with people and helping them when it comes to negotiating, is there a specific challenge that you normally see that they're coming across outside of their own internal mindset and fears?
Yeah. I mean, that first 50% of the hurdle is just people not wanting to ask. And, but to answer your question beyond that, one of the biggest challenges is people undervalue themselves and not swinging hard enough, even in this environment. Just because, yes, the economy is rough, the job market is tough. When I first was helping people full-time as job offer negotiation coach, a couple of years ago, it was about a 4-month job search, 3-4 months. Now it's 6. So that part has not changed for the most part, but it actually gives you leverage, even if you only have one offer. If you get an offer in this environment, you have leverage because you are by far the best candidate. And therefore, you can still make your move. I had a lot of people that I worked with initially that said, I'm worried if I only get one offer, I'm unemployed, I got laid off, I don't have a leg to stand on. I'm like, au contraire, mon frère. So being able to have that awareness of the landscape, self-belief, and then advocate for yourself is kind of the 3 elements that we hit on initially, get someone to ask. Then when they do ask, making sure they squeeze appropriately. Now, think about this, guys. Your career grows linearly, right? Year 2, year 5, year 10. But your leverage grows exponentially, typically, right? I mean, and I say this even as somebody who had 5 different careers. So I was still waiting for my leverage to grow by the time I was in my late 20s on career number 3 or 4. But then once I got into something, then it started to compound. There are individuals who maybe they come right out of college and they do the same thing, stick with software, accounting, marketing, whatever the case may be. And so they're building that leverage. And by job number 3 or 4, they have more leverage than they think. And so if you don't negotiate, let's just say job right out of college, that's your first opportunity. And it really only takes 1 minute to actually negotiate your salary, right, guys? I mean, to actually say the words. And so it's a rare minute that you get, though. You only get it every 2 to 5 to 10 years, depending on how long you stay in a role. And let's say you switch companies 7 times in your career. That's 7 minutes to negotiate your entire life's earnings.
Right? It's kind of ridiculous.
It is.
Now, when you put it that way, I'm like, holy crap.
Right. And it's not a minute you're trained for, educated on, and especially if in the rest of your life and the rest of your career, you don't feel fully comfortable setting boundaries, advocating for yourself, pushing back, asking for more. It's tough to go from 0 to 100 when it's like the Olympics, if you haven't been training. So that's why I always advocate any opportunity you get, when there's an opportunity to negotiate, do it so that you can build that muscle for when your leverage is growing to its maximum. Then you can really squeeze appropriately.
That's a really great point. I think too, sometimes when people look at it, and back to the stat I started us with about, how much a single raise or promotion can be worth over one's lifetime, back to the compound side of things, because it does continue to build up, because then your next one is based off of that, because they're often a percentage or a dollar amount over whatever you had before. Now, that doesn't mean it's too late. Somebody should be like, well, I already missed some of those early years. No, it means do so now, because at the same time, then you have other levers that could work to your benefit when they start to look at, pay, what's the term?
Transparency.
Pay transparency. And then there's one more thing I can't think of, but that's ultimately looking at, why is this person getting this much and this person getting this much? And often
Equity?
Pay equity. That's the one. So in that scenario, it's like there are companies that will look at that to try to bring people up, especially in the job market where they realize that there's a risk if they don't. So I think people do have that opportunity later. But again, it's more likely to happen for the individuals that might be, that are obviously very good at what they do and willing to advocate for themselves. I'm curious though, oh, go ahead. Were you going to say something?
Oh, sorry. I did want to tap on that and let me know if this is where you're going to go anyway. But on the pay transparency, pay equity, look, companies have to do that now. I think it's really great for the candidate and employees across America that they have, in certain states at least, the access to a bit more data on the salary side. But there's 2 things. Number one, it's still not fully reflective of the entire compensation opportunity, usually. I have seen some pay transparency ranges in job descriptions. The companies say this is inclusive of your salary and bonus.
Right. Or it's a big $200,000 range.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, it's either a wild spread, which means they don't actually know what they want to pay for the role. They just threw something together to be compliant. And or they are lumping in some bonus incentive type structures into that range to give them more plausible deniability about when they give you a certain salary. So and then, of course, in the tech world, or if you're an executive, there's equity, which is never disclosed in a salary or in a job description. But going beyond that, what a company has to do is not what it's willing to do fully, right? So the idea that everyone should remember, especially when you're interviewing for a job and you get the offer, your leverage is the highest it will most likely ever be with that company. And think of it as a bucket that you fill up, a bucket of leverage you fill up during the interview process. And once they offer you the job, then you drain that bucket, maximizing how much you ask for. And then if it works, then you get in the job, and then you fill that bucket back up by performing well. And that takes usually longer. And I have more to say about that, but that's what I wanted to tap on is just because a company has to do certain things, you advocating for yourself can push them to do more.
I like how you put that with the buckets, because I think that's so true. And it's easier to fill that first, or it takes shorter time period to usually fill up that first bucket than it will the second bucket, because it literally is just the question at that point and asking for it. That's a big piece of it. That said, obviously, I know there's key to how it's positioned. So I'm curious if you have a story, an example you could share of somebody you helped through that process, what that looked like, and maybe what the outcome was.
Sure. There's several key junctures during the salary negotiation process that are really important. Kind of like when we used to go to the mall and there was that map that said you are here. That's important to think about is when is money discussed? And money is discussed, most people think, when you get the offer. But the negotiation actually starts on the first phone call when the recruiter says, what are your salary expectations? Because in states like California, and a few others, they can't ask, what do you currently make? Which, even if you are in a state where they can, you should never answer that question unless it's truly advantageous. If you make a boatload of money, you're like, I make total comp of $450, don't waste my time. You're going to pay me more? Otherwise, beyond that, you shouldn't be saying how much you make. So anyway, they just have been flipping it the last few years, and they say, what are your salary expectations? This is your opportunity to do two things. One, you want to punt and get more information, because it's too early on that very first phone call for you to start talking numbers in most scenarios, because your leverage is the least and you know the least information about the scope of the role and what the company's even willing to pay. Because every company pays a little bit different, a little bit flavor of different in the ratios, even if they're all a tech company or all entertainment or all oil and gas, whatever the case may be. They may follow some of the same lines in the elements of compensation that they have, but the mix between and the magnitude is where the differences really show. So I coach my clients to say to the recruiter, I'm so glad we're talking about this. Can you tell me what your company's compensation philosophy is for this role? So this is where you kind of deflect and you put it back in their court to elicit more information. Because remember, ultimately, it's about total compensation. It's not just salary. So like, when's the last time you guys bought a car? What was the first question they asked you?
How much are you willing to spend, or what's your monthly payment? Yeah.
What's your month? Yeah. How much do you want to pay per month? Exactly. And so if you answer that question, you fall into their frame, and then they do the 4-box on you, and then, the points and end up on the back end, all sorts of bad things. So when the recruiter says, what are your salary expectations? You need more information. And that's where, when you say, what is your compensation philosophy? Usually they'll just tell you what the range is. Hey, there's a bonus. It's a 15% target. A lot of tech companies, besides all the FANG ones, don't really have bonuses. So they say base salary range is X to Y, and there's new hire equity maybe around this magnitude. So that's great information. But then they'll bounce the ball back in your court, and they'll say, does that work for you? And this is where two things are important. Number one, your market research on your value and your skill set and how you are translating that into what you want next, but also your understanding of your skill set at various companies as it culminates into the right level. You have to get the qualitative right before you define the quantitative. And leveling issues are some of the most biggest areas that I see people stumble as far as getting what they're worth.
So I'm curious there, actually, as you say, a couple of those things is when a person is countered back to that question, how should they respond I understand the punting it, but at what point do they answer, or how should they answer that then still gets them to the upper range they would like to get paid?
Sure. So when you say, what is your compensation philosophy? They give you some ranges. Then they say, does that work for you? Or you can say, well, before I commit to any numbers, I like to understand the full scope of the role and how many of my skill sets you need. I'd love to continue the process. What is the best next step?
Nice. Okay, great. And then at some point later, they push you again on it. Then what?
Right. And look, there are sometimes, good 60% of the time that probably works. When I was, the fun thing about on the salary negotiation stuff that I coach, I've done everything I asked my clients to do. Both when I was in my career and when I was transitioning out, I was still looking for jobs at the last tail end and went on a ton of interviews. And I was like, oh, this is great. I get to put all this stuff into practice again, like keeping it fresh. And on this topic, I went back and forth 6 times with the recruiter. He's like, does that work for you? Well, I'd like to see more about the role before I commit to numbers. Yeah, but I really need a number. Well, I just want to understand, we went back and forth, and finally he's like, look, I just need to put something in the system. I said, look, I'm open to a competitive offer. He's like, great.
$2 million. Why don't you put $2 million?
Yeah, exactly. Now, I'll give you another flavor of that. My last role that I had, especially this is important if you understand your leverage, and I knew my leverage. I had just come from SpaceX. I had a solid decade in the industry at some of the highest levels, most marquee companies. So I knew that wherever I landed next was going to be a place that I wanted to make sure that I was going to get paid. And so we did the dance. They said, what do you want? I'm like, what's your compensation philosophy? She drops the ranges and for the numbers, says, does that work for you? I punt. She's like, well, I really would like to know. I'm like, well, as long as I'll come in towards in the top end of that salary range and your new hire equity is as robust as I'm seeing with some of the other conversations I'm having, I'm sure we can come to an agreement.
Nice.
And so I anchored high, and then the first offer was quite high.
Excellent. And then after that, did you say cool because it was high, or did you still count?
Well, I was just zooming to the end of the interview process for you to tell you how it ended. But at that juncture of the conversation, she's like, fine. And we moved on, and she scheduled the first round of interviews.
Okay, got it. But now I'm curious, how did it, in that situation, would you in the end still counter or recommend somebody countered if you'd already asked to hire and they came back at the higher end?
So you're talking about at the end of the process when someone gets an offer?
Yeah.
And so you're saying if someone comes in, if a company does sort of meet your philosophical desire to come in towards the high end of the range, do you still counter that offer?
Yeah.
Well, my HGTV inspired quote, every job offer negotiation deserves at least one good counter.
Okay. That's what I assume, back to what you were saying. So just making sure, because I think that's where, again, some people get uncomfortable because they're like, well, I mean, they did come in there. I don't want to push it once more. Whatever reason, we just feel like pushing it, but it's not like they're going to say, yeah, never mind.
And I'm glad you asked. And that feeling right there is what I help. Good half of my clients are afraid to even ask. The other half, I'm like, I'm willing to ask, but then the first offer comes in amazing. And they're like, well, I don't know. And here's the other thing. A lot of people also experience urgency that they self-impose. Like, I hate my current job, or I'm very excited about the new one. I just want to get started. Because the 3 biggest things that I hear women say about not wanting to negotiate is, number 1, they don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to come off as too much, and they don't want to be seen as greedy. And so all 3 of those things impact people in pumping the brakes when the stakes are high like that.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think there's also these different expectations or perceptions of men versus women when it comes to some of those asks. So I think it feeds that even a little bit more so, some of those fears, even though it's like in the end, ask.
And I still see men experience a lot of those things as well around the hesitation to ask, especially if the first offer is good. And that's the thing is, there are other elements. Maybe the first offer is maxed out on base. Fine. But what about equity? And then, of course, let's not forget sign-on bonus. So, just being able to move through the process and get all 3 elements, that's the trifecta that I really try and help my clients get. I call it the toothpaste strategy because, if you're rolling a tube of toothpaste going slow and methodically, you'll get everything out. If you go too fast, you're going to leave some behind.
Aaron, using your example of asking for that higher end and then actually the offer coming in higher end, what are some non-monetary, like anything that's not financial related stuff that you could negotiate on? Like, what would you recommend people negotiate? Is it, can I get more remote work? Can I get more vacation? Like, what are some things that you've seen?
I've seen both. I think when it comes to non-monetary things like that, it's important to make sure that you are negotiating something that obviously you're negotiating it so it works for you, but also it fits the culture of the company. There's some times where asking for too much vacation is going to be seen as a bit of a red flag. The whole remote work thing, again, it's all about your leverage. One of my recent clients, unfortunately, I can't say because, it's weird about what I do. It's all very confidential. I wish I could say, but one of probably
you're a doctor. It's patient confidentiality. Yeah.
Yeah. But I will say probably the best negotiation in history that I saw go down. And, there was a couple of things. Number one was thinking about what's possible. And then two, dollars are just one component. You can negotiate so much more than dollars. And scope was something that he negotiated as a part of his offer. So to expand the question, the answer for you guys, scope, work location, and now especially if you're in management, I'd say senior manager plus all the way up to executive, you want to negotiate things that are going to help you do your job, like headcount, resources, training budgets, stuff like that. Because yes, hey, I got hired to be an SCP at a company, I got a big salary, big comp package, I'm happy, but then you get in, you're hamstrung, and you're not given the appropriate headcount and so on and so forth. It's kind of a Pyrrhic victory.
Have you seen success with that or been with that client long enough to understand if there were commitments around like headcount and stuff that they stuck to it? And because it's not normally something that they'll be like, sure, we'll put that in writing. And I don't know if you push for that in writing or if that, but it's something that I could see a company easily being like, oh yeah, absolutely, you're going to be able to build this team. And then they get in there like, oh yeah, except for that whole hiring freeze or whatever it is we got going on.
Yeah, look, those things typically don't get put in writing. At a minimum, though, it's about having the clarity to see the full field and the landscape of this new role, so that you can get your tools that you need. I haven't had an extended contact with people who've been in that situation, but just my own HR experience, just seeing how headcount moves around, it can get taken away quickly, and I think you being able to at least broach that topic in the interview process, is going to help you do two things. Number one, display that you are generally the best person for the role because you have that management lens and that view across the organization. But number two, since you're bringing it up, you yourself will be able to ascertain, are they going to hold to this commitment? Because it really, what this is all about is helping you find the truth. And if you feel like they're being too cagey and wanting to commit, that could be a red flag for you as a candidate as to whether you would like to join that company or not.
It makes sense. It's like going on that date, saying, do you want to have kids? And depending on how they responded to that question, red flag.
Yeah.
I also think that a third benefit of that is at that point, because, a company already, depending on the time cycle you might come in that year, might already have only a certain number of headcount or whatever approved. But there's the chance, depending on how much it's been fought for, that you now move up in the line because you've highlighted it. They feel a certain commitment by telling you that, yes, that is something you could do. And it increases your chances of winning that headcount as well, at least some of what I've seen. So,
yeah, exactly.
Okay. So obviously here, there's no doubt that everybody should be negotiating one way or another. And I'm curious if, a little bit more of what we focused on, like coming into a job, which completely understand is critical. But what if somebody's in a role and they believe that they're underpaid? How would you recommend they go about increasing their salary or negotiating that salary increase that they believe they deserve?
My other favorite question. So this is, I would say a lot of the principles of negotiating as a candidate are synonymous with being in a role where that you want to stay at. One thing, the biggest difference is time. Negotiating as a candidate, despite what I said, yes, it takes several months to get a job. But once you're in the negotiation phase, it usually goes pretty quick. We'll call it days or weeks max. When you're in a job, it's months, like many, many months. It's a campaign. So number one, being aware of that, but also using that to your advantage or leveraging that. So knowing where you are in time is the most important thing, meaning what is your company's performance here? When do performance reviews get assessed? When you sit down with your manager normally and get your raise, and here's your letter, you get a 5% increase, you get a bonus of this much, maybe an equity grant. When does that happen? You want to start doing inception about 5 months before that. And obviously, wherever you are in time, you should start, and we'll go into that in a second. But the real thing is, if you can catch that, that's enough time for you to start getting clear about what your manager wants to see in order for them to feel good about giving you above average increase. And this is for if you feel underpaid or not. This is just about developing leverage to get more.
Makes complete sense, and that's I'm fully with you on that. And it's always funny how a lot of people are not funny, unfortunate, late blooming that happens, because sometimes people only think about that and jump into action when it's time for that end of year self-evaluation, or depending on the organization, what one's doing. And then by that point, it's generally too late, or at least your chances are a lot lower. I'll never say it's too late, because somebody should always try versus nothing. But yeah, you've got to inception it in advance to make your chances a lot more increased, get the right people that you need to be able to support you.
Yeah, that annual review meeting should be the answer, not the question.
Yes, great point. And for most, sadly, I think it is, the question at that point. So,
well, this is the consequence of people not being educated on this topic. We go to college. Imagine spending 4 years and 5 to 6 figures to fail the first question out of college when the recruiter asks, "What are your salary expectations?" Right? So, this is why I'm very passionate about what I do, is giving a lot of this inside thinking so that you can maximize your earnings that you've worked so hard to develop that skill set to even do. I help people drop in that capstone of the Roman arch so they can maximize their earnings. And in a situation like that, if you wait until that annual review to ask the question, like you said, I would never say you shouldn't. Now is the best time to start if it wasn't yesterday, right? But if you do it then, your manager would be like, "Oh, I didn't realize. Let's put together a plan so that in 2026, you can get an increase."
Yeah, there's this story that has stuck with me from my own career when early on I was in a temp role at Disney. So temporary role, they hire, from a agency.
A staffing agency, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And at that time, actually, I was there, ended up pulling Art in actually over there, and that's where we had started together, and a fellow named Krishna as well. And what ended up happening is the area I was in a boss who wasn't favored by the head of the department. On top of that, I was in an area they were considering outsourcing. But here I was working hard, doing things like coming in the middle of the night to talk, to territories to make sure that, we could turn those translations faster. And anyway, all these sort of things, thinking in my mind, these are the things that I should be doing to position myself well. And nothing came to be. So there was an opportunity for me to go over to DreamWorks and take a full-time role over there. So I made that jump, and I had an exit interview. And in that exit interview, the head of the department at the time, because in my email I said, "Oh, I really wish I could have got a full-time gig here." That I had the conversation with him. He goes, "Oh, I never realized you were looking for a full-time gig," which in many ways, I'm like, how did you not know? I was over here working hard. But that stuck with me, because like the things that we might think are common sense, they're not common. Like the way he looked at it, and this was for Art and I both, is you guys were, or even, again, back to Christian, you guys are in the, you work in pursuing filmmaking, or he was preferring, music. And it's like, when you look at that, he actually thought doing us a favor, not giving us a permanent position that was going to take us from there. And it's just such this interesting thing that you don't see and know, again, until you have that conversation. And in my situation, because it got as far as me being like, I'm frustrated and ready to go, that I then, left the company. Later on, I came back again and actually, learned everything I knew about advancing my career at a much quicker place, because I learned those sort of things. But I think that is so critical. And you said something else earlier too, that it's the feedback. I mean, because that's the worst case scenario. And I think sometimes people are afraid that they're going to get feedback, maybe that either no is not the thing I think they're afraid of sometimes. What they're afraid of is you're not performing at the level we want. And it's almost like they're like, if I say this, does that mean I'm out of here? Like, oh shoot, they've caught up to me. Or does it mean they have to now do more or other things? And depending on where they're at, some of those could be painful for them. But to me, you either win or you learn what you need to do to be able to now achieve that. And then you put it into play. And now the role of reciprocity kicks in, because they ultimately had said, yeah, you do these things, I'll be able to do it more. You now deliver on those things. They're more likely to deliver for you what you want the next time. But it won't happen if you don't have that conversation.
Yeah, totally. The fact that you could find out the truth and it may not be good is still valuable. A lot of people think they're doing well, but the manager is not so sure. And so you want to have that conversation so they say, oh, I thought I was doing well. You don't think I am? Well, I'm working on objectives we set in the beginning of the year. Now it's around mid-year. Things change all the time. I wasn't aware that, maybe something is different now that I should be focusing on. So in corporate America and tech, like usually people have a one-on-one with their manager maybe every 2 weeks, but not all the time. And people can go months. They talk to their manager every day about tactical stuff, but they're not actually having dialogue about, hey, this is my objectives. This is my career, like you said, in your situation. And also, these are the things I'm working on. Do you feel if I continue working on these things at the end of the year, if I do a really good job, would it be out of the question for me to get an outsized increase?
Right.
Because your manager will never say, yes, definitely. They'll never commit. They can't. But you at least want to not give them plausible deniability at the end of the year to when they say, oh, I didn't know you wanted more.
Totally agree. And it is a bit of that inception too, once more, so that they're then thinking about that. And then later on when they get to it and they have to decide how the dollars are going to be dispersed, they knew they had a conversation with you, which is going to position you a lot better than the person who never brought it up.
Yeah. And that was the structural thing I wanted to bring up is by getting to them early and getting their mind primed that, hey, this employee wants this much. When it comes time to start apportioning the budget, probably a month and a half to 2 months before they sit down with you, they're going to need to carve out some for you if you want extra. And if they don't know it, they're not going to do it.
I think when we're using a term like manager or leader here, we're assuming a seasoned leader, somebody that actually knows how the game works and, they've been through it. But what if somebody is now under a very new green leader that can say the right things, but actually doesn't know how to navigate the situation? And now you're there stuck thinking that you're actually going to progress in your career, not realizing that your manager is actually too new of a leader to actually know how to make this happen. How long do you wait? Do you stay patient or do you throw your hands up and say, I got to make a change here?
Quit immediately. Just kidding. No, it's delicate, but here's I've had seasoned managers and I've had people it was their first rodeo. And so this is an opportunity for you to develop your own executive presence. One of the key tenets of executive presence is being able to manage up. And so, remember Intel in the 90s and early 2000s, that marketing campaign? No one knew about Intel in the consumer market. But once they realized that, oh, Dell has Intel, they were marketing through Dell to the consumer. You may have to do the same thing with your manager to their higher ups. As far as, getting your name on the radar so that they'll be able to say, oh, so-and-so, and then the VP knows who the heck they're even talking about.
Sorry, I was going to say, and that's so critical for a lot of roles too, where you're going to need that buy-in because it's not always just your own leader's decision.
Yeah, I mean, especially in a large like Disney, a Fortune 1000 company, there's going to be, if you have a person with a manager title, there's likely senior manager above that, then director, then senior director, then VP. And then in some, there's like an EVP before you hit.
And an SVP. Yeah, we've seen them all. Yeah, keep tossing them in.
Totally. So there's a lot of bosses at each level as you go up, right? And so does your manager have A, the budget, and B, the political capital internally to be able to advocate for something special for you? That's something you're going to have to suss out. So there's a two-pronged strategy. The first one is to manage up through your manager and say, hey, this is the type of visibility that I want. These are the objectives I'm going to hit. The delicate thing is getting visibility directly with people who are above your manager. And it's delicate because you want to do it without making your manager feel circumvented, not valued. so on and so forth. And you don't obviously do it with that intention, but sometimes if you have deemed that your manager does not have the political capital, the influence skills to advocate for yourself or to advocate on your behalf properly, you may need to take matters in your own hands. And it's a risk. I'll say it right now.
Yeah.
But, do you want to sit and just let year after year tick by because your manager may not have the courage, the clarity, however you want to phrase it, to really push it and say, well, I'm going to give you 3% again this year, and they maybe come up with a different excuse. Either are you not performing well, or if you have every other piece of anecdotal data that you are doing well, and if you start to make inroads with other departments or a skip level manager or an executive, something like that, if those aren't working, then you have the final option, which is the best way to get a raise in corporate America is to switch companies.
Right. What are your thoughts on when people do get a competitive offer somewhere else, leveraging that as part of your negotiation at a company if you do want to stay at that company?
Yeah. Also delicate, but definitely worth a shot if I would say certain pieces of criteria are in place. Number one, you feel that you have enough leverage, enough value at the current place where they really just don't want to lose you. Also understanding culturally how that is taken. There are certain companies I've seen like, oh, they got another offer. That means they were looking. That means that they're not
loyal. Yeah.
So, there's that. And so that's where you have to determine for yourself, how much do I value the learning experience here, the exposure, just what maybe you have an outward facing role. And like, this is my title at this company in this industry. If I go somewhere else, will it be as good? So a lot of things to consider, but here's the other side to it. I've seen people advocate for a raise internally for a long time and not really get it. And, they get the standard raise at annual merit, but nothing exciting. Then suddenly they get an offer and the manager's falling all over themselves to get them something special, right? So other offers induce some type of, I don't know if it's a gene or a synapses fire that normally don't, but it does something usually that allows magic to occur.
I also think some of it depends on the industry, the job market. There's some of that too, depending on how they're working. I know as Netflix came up and Disney kept, having people get job offers at, Netflix, they realized, gosh, how do we do this? But at the same time, they weren't willing to compete against the pay of Netflix because Netflix would come in at really high pay. So there's this fine balance between all of that. And depending on, in that situation, the boss, sometimes there was the boss who's like, no, you've already decided that you want to go somewhere else. See you later. And then in other cases, another boss could be like, I understand this. You're looking out for yourself and your best. So that's that boss in your relationship can sometimes play such a huge role in that. And I would say somebody probably shouldn't even try that, using the other job offer if they don't have a good relationship with their boss, because chances are it's going to, never say, doesn't hurt to try as long as you're willing to leave. But just know that the likelihood is it's going to be a no.
Yeah, maybe. It's two criteria. It's boss and budget. So what is your boss's, how are they going to take it? Also, it's what is your company's compensation philosophy? Do they have the ability, like if you go from a more traditional media company to Netflix has a unique compensation philosophy. They pay at the top of your own personal market.
Right. And I think the third one that you had also mentioned too is just in general, even if the boss wants to do it, even if the budget's there, if ultimately the company does not support that, because up higher, they have a rule, if you will, that says, nope, never counter that.
It's like the government approach of
we don't negotiate with
hostage negotiation.
Yeah. Actually, that's a almost perfect segue. Because the book behind you there, and I wanted to bring up Chris.
How did that get there?
Yeah, exactly. So Chris Voss, being somebody who's a former FBI negotiator, as well as somebody that people know today very well in just as an expert in negotiation, you have the you two had worked together and collaborated on this book. So I'm curious to just hear a little bit more about that and your role.
Yeah, that was a really cool opportunity. I had, I'm part of his email list, and one day he said, do you want to write a book with me? So I joined the call, and there was a screening process for someone that could contribute a chapter to this book that you see behind me. And it was a collaborative effort of Chris, myself, and a host about 24 other entrepreneurs and thought leaders, that we all wrote this book on using empathy and understanding in business. With people who know Chris and his first book, which is Never Split the Difference, Negotiate Like Your Life Depends on It. One of the core tenets of that book that made me love it so much was using tactical empathy, which is a core foundation of what I have for my coaching world, which is managing the conversation. And so I realized, the power of empathy in business, in life. So we went a little deeper in this book, sharing stories, anecdotes, lessons, and strategies on how you can use empathy and understanding in your world.
Nice. And I do think that is so critical to that process, because even, if you don't, and if you lack, and if you're not also thinking about it in terms of the company and other things, the boss, those, like your chance of success is a lot lower. It's like, I don't want to say, how do you get in the minds of others, but in order, you got to be able to empathize to understand it, to be able to achieve, at least I think. But I'm curious to your perspective on how you see that tying in.
Huge. I mean, going back to what we were just saying, if you have a manager who you don't feel has the political capital internally, or the influence, or maybe doesn't believe that you're doing a great job, using empathy to understand their situation and tease out, as Chris says, that black swan piece of information to see what's really going on. That's how you can get there. Being curious, using tactical empathy, just to figure out what areas that maybe you aren't thinking of are really at play so that you can have an outcome that you want.
Kind of related to that, because while I'm mixing a little bit here with empathy and with mindset, there's a relationship here. And, I think one thing you were mentioning earlier about, sometimes it is, helping people off their own ledge. And I think this is the key. I think there's a lot of people out there who, when they think about coaches in general, they might think, oh, well, I can figure this out. I can watch a YouTube video, or I could do this stuff. And by the way, you can figure a lot of it out, but it's that piece when it comes down to the part of a coach that can play psychologist is the best way I could kind of see it, which is why I was joking earlier about, doctor-patient confidentiality. But because that's that piece, it's that part. Heck, my sister's going through it now and trying to buy a car. It's that last one. It's like, go again and ask one more time. I don't want to ask again. It's like, just like the person who's literally pushing, because the difference there in its own right in that first year can pay for, the coach and then some, let alone the compound of that over time, and the confidence that comes with doing it, getting that benefit and reward, which then means next time you're more likely to step out, if you will, and, ask that thing that otherwise before whatever invisible script told you, don't do it. But now you have more confidence around that.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, the invisible script. I mean, that script just needs to be rewritten. I say just, it wants to be capital.
Yes.
Big component of what I do, and these are things people experience for their whole life, right? But it is changeable. And once you are able to point that script in a better direction, you can have the outcomes that you want.
Yeah. I was recently working with somebody, and, at the end of a conversation they're like, they feel so free now. Even if the conversation in that particular case, they got, the feedback and that was at it, which is what I would have expected based on no inception happening, in advance. But, and also this one, and this is always a big red flag to me, is I know some companies, some people will say this is more normal, but if you don't have that regular meeting with the boss, some people I've heard it's a badge of honor. Oh no, they just trust me. I do my work. I only have to meet with them once a month or once every 2 months. I'm like, no, you're missing out on all those opportunities you won. I remember having my boss push out meetings with my other team members at times because my boss wanted to make sure they continue to meet with me because of the value I was bringing, and they were willing to push the other ones out. And I think there's this interesting balance where you got to make sure that you don't see that as a benefit because you're so trusted. You want, that sort of time, and that helps you to illustrate your value so that when the time comes, the conversation is, I don't want to say no-brainer, but much easier.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen that in our careers and our work life, and even in personal relationships, right? The person who seems like they got it all together and is good and continues to weather the storm, they need some acknowledgement and appreciation as well. And on the company side, on the career side, no matter what you do, we all work in marketing for ourselves. And so you want that time with your ideal customer avatar to be able to talk to them.
Exactly. And I think most people are so uncomfortable or don't want to think of themselves in that role sometimes, or they just assume my work speaks for itself. And sadly, the performance is only a piece of it, but when you start thinking about the image side of it and how people are seeing it, those other components are so critical too. And it's the marketing side that you nailed there.
Yeah, thank you. And that's another thing that comes up with the people that I work with is they want to be humble. They don't want to be braggadocious. It's a term that frequently comes up. And I say it's not bragging if it's true.
Yeah. I always like to have people, sometimes people struggle to do that for themselves, but when you're leading a team, it's easier to do it for the team. And therefore, conversely, it helps, you because you're lifting up your team. So there are, different ways around that.
Yeah. I had a client who did exactly that. She advocated for her team, but not herself. And so working to get her to be able to advocate for herself, because companies, I don't think they do this maliciously, but they assume if you don't say anything, you're happy, you're good. And so this is where you got to step in and say, hey, I just asked for a special budget for my 5-member team, whatever the case may be. And by the way, yours truly would like something as well.
No, totally agree. Looking ahead at 2025 in job market, I'm just curious whether or not you have any specific predictions for where you see it coming. Like sometimes there's these studies out there that will say next year, expect status quo when it comes to, and not to say we always know that we could push past status quo because we're going to ask those questions as you said early on, but do you think the market is going to be more or less accepting of people pushing for more raises?
I think the market from a macro level typically always wants employees to not. But there's always pockets of opportunity. And in my experience over the decade plus of doing offers at multiple different companies from top to bottom, there's always some room. And really, again, it's about finding out the truth. So I guess the way I'm answering your questions, it's irrelevant whether the market is going to be open to it or not. It's more about you being able to see how you can manage the conversation to create the opportunity and the leverage to ask for more. And it reveals the truth. And then you can decide, do I still want to take this job or not? But really what you're doing is not letting the market dictate whether you utilize the muscle of self-advocacy or not.
Answered like a pro negotiator, because I do think that piece is it's leverage. And if you have the leverage, if you're the top performer, you could communicate that, then in many ways, it doesn't matter what the market is. What matters is how you position all of that, because a top performer could still stand out with the right, again, leverage as somebody who's worth paying above what the salary is, or getting that raise, because companies in those time periods, I mean, Art and I faced this a lot when there was always reorgs or, down markets or whatever it is. When we were at Disney, or if a stock was underperforming, it's like we were still able to progress and have that, yes, because we were still doing many of these things that you had mentioned and acknowledged. So very, very good point. And hopefully people, can remember that and not go into their cocoons that says, oh, the market's down, I better not ask. Or, I read an article that said this year it's only going to be 3%. Screw that.
I was at this funny idea, which I don't think it's in practice anywhere, but that's why I want to ask you. There is that, 90%, there's a 10% top performer, but usually there's that, I'm just making up numbers, 0.5%, or, even less than that are like your top performers that you can't lose. I always thought, why not pay those people like athletes? There is no range, it's all about what, how much value do they bring. I'm curious what you think about that, and if you've seen that in practice anywhere.
And Netflix was in many ways like that, by the way.
Well, that's Netflix's entire corporate culture and comp philosophy in essence. But Netflix is only one company, right? I would say Netflix is probably the pinnacle of comp philosophies. Just under them are companies like Google, FANG, because they're the ones they were the first with the ping pong tables and the large compensation packages. And there's some niche industries, finance, of course. You work in hedge fund or somewhere on Wall Street, there's big bonus opportunities, maybe oil and gas, right? There's respective pockets. But what I'm leading up to is there are companies who would say, no, I don't agree, but then they do it anyway, right? And so that's where a company has to confront itself, its HR policies, its compensation philosophy, its workforce management about, do we have exceptions becoming the rule? And this type of stuff happens regardless, whether a company says it does it or not. It's just, will it be you?
And, I think too, sometimes just thinking about Netflix again, there's a yin and yang, because there was that, high top of market pay, but there was also the keeper test, which is the idea that regularly reviewing, are you getting paid? Well, two ways. One, should you be paid more? And they regularly reviewed that even off cycle. But at the other hand is, are they really a stunning colleague is kind of how they looked at it in the terms. And if not, the keeper test is, would you continue to pay them what you're paying them to keep them? But the answer is no, then goodbye. So that's, a bit of a balance companies have to look at, or at least they have to look at from approaching it with that sort of philosophy.
Yeah, Netflix gives managers a generous budget for severance, so they don't feel bad about letting someone go.
No, it's totally it, which is, again, really unique, but also in some ways brilliant, but in other ways also like it would be hard for every company to operate in that way because the culture is built around so much of that as well.
Well, and that's the most, I think, important thing, when we talk about these companies that pay really well and all that, that's actually not most companies. They're not earning well enough or confident enough in their future earnings to lean forward and say, this is our comp philosophy. Like Google's like, we have a 90th percentile compensation philosophy, 90th percentile in the market data, right? Most companies don't forward lean like that. They say, we're 50th percentile and then pay people here and there very well. And so that's where if you're silent, you're not going to get what you potentially could, whether it's, I'll phrase it to you like this, especially in opaque environments where there's not a lot of structure. Maybe it's a newer company, a newer startup, or just a kind of a crazy company like some of the ones I worked at when I went there. And there wasn't that, hey, this is a level 1, 2, 3. This is what we pay in each one, and everyone's committed to this. If there's not that, that's an opaque environment. And opaque environments will cut against you disproportionately if you say nothing, and could swing in your favor disproportionately if you do say something.
As you jumped into your own, business here, as you have, and as I know you're preparing to launch a course here soon, what ultimately, like, if anybody else, some of our listeners are interested in either taking their side hustles that same way, or some of them are just like, forget it, I just want to leave and try this. Any advice that you'd have for people who are looking to establish their own company of any sort?
Yeah. Make sure that you have a genuine passion around it. I know there's some very influential people. I think Scott Galloway, who I do like, he also says, don't pursue your passion. It's BS. We win sold the line.
I know everybody goes back and forth on, yeah.
Yeah, everyone goes back and forth. But, as take it from somebody who I pursued corporate success as the goal. Yeah. Whether I liked the job or not. And I got to SpaceX, and that was pretty cool. And I burned out super hard. And for a long time, I was going to so many other events and buying courses online because I wanted to do something different and really getting tapped in with your why. For me, I wanted to do something I was very passionate about, and coaching is that. I feel very aligned to this, and I feel very good at what I do. But also, number two, I wanted to control my time and my location. And so those were things that motivated me to choose something like this. And you should have that criteria for yourself as well, because you do need commitment to get through it. I say this, the next category is, if you're going to leave corporate America to go do something on your own, start disabusing yourself of the employee mentality. Being able to focus on what's revenue producing, just because it's a task, an administrative task, it doesn't mean it needs to be done.
Right. That's a great point there. And I think
great point.
Yeah. Something that you see a lot of individuals, and I left corporate America. I'm like, I had to redo some of my programming that was, done from there, because there's a different mentality, and especially as people are often, earlier in their careers more, but this is the task, this is that responsibility, this is the thing. For you, now that you've made this jump, because did you start it as a side hustle, or did you just jump straight into it and say, here we go?
No, it was probably one of the world's longest highway merges ever. It started as a side hustle. I got my first certification in 2018, to become a certified high performance coach, because I was already helping people negotiate their salaries, but I decided I wanted to help the whole person. And then
Yeah.
recently, I actually completed a 7-month training in trauma and somatics because I realized the body is what really makes most decisions. And so being able to get in there and see more about what's holding you back from advocating for yourself, from setting boundaries, having tough conversations, whatever the case may be, that's where transformation is really possible. So it's been this evolution of, I'd say, the last 6.5, 7 years of doing the work, getting clients on the side, building up, the processes and the modalities that create transformation. Actually, that was the last year and a half, a year and 3/4, I've been out of W-2 life gratefully, full time. And you may see me at a conference somewhere, or maybe see this face in an Instagram ad one day. Who knows?
Right. Well, and as you say that, whether it's an Instagram ad or not, what was the first method you took to acquiring your first customers?
I'm an aggressive friend maker. I like meeting new people.
You will be my friend.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, careful. We have a conversation. I will ask you to hang out. But
all I can think of is like a Pixar character, like some.
Yeah, exactly. Let's picture. I would just go to a lot of conferences and just meet people, and then I'm breaking a coaching rule by having 2 customer avatars. But on the women in salary negotiation side, I approached a lot of women's professional groups and said I'd love to give a presentation on how the game works, and that's been pretty cool. I love Q&A. It's my favorite part. So doing that has been pretty fruitful.
Yeah, I'm similarly breaking that avatar, but on one hand, I'm like, okay, partner in the other one. It's like, be more the face of this one, so I could be the face here. But I've thought about that different times, how you do that. But maybe you could just create a new AI version of you for one business, and then the other one could show up for the.
I mean, I'm not disinterested in it, but we don't have it yet.
All right, how can people find you?
So resparkcoaching.com is my website, and on there you can join my email list. Also, by the time this is out, you can click and you'll see the ability to get my free PDF on the things that you should consider before any job offer negotiation if you join my email list. Also, I'm on all social platforms at Aaron Thweatt, my name, 2 A's, Aaron, last name, Thweatt.
Awesome. Well, we enjoyed having you. Thank you. And for our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, you'll probably like this one too, if I'm pointing in the right place over here somewhere or another. Thank you, Aaron.
Yeah. What did you guys love most about today's talk?
Oh, boy. There were a lot of things. Let's say, for me, I think about it in terms of what's also going to resonate for our audience is, I think just the advocacy side and people acknowledging and realizing like the importance of that and the inception thing that you said. I love that because while I've always thought about it, you've now made me tie that to the movie itself, because sadly, that is a big part of the game. There's a lot of politics that happen within an organization. And in many ways, that's what politics is when you start thinking about it, is how do you get your thoughts and ideas out there in advance so that when it comes time for the things that you want to accomplish, you have a great chance to.
I really like your bucket analysis of leverage. It fills up and then goes down, and that stuck with me.
And I like that you asked this question too.
The coach in me is old habits die hard. I appreciate you guys so much. Thank you so very much for having me.
You got it, man. Good to have you.